All right, folks, let's go ahead and get started. Make sure I'm off mute here. Yep. Welcome to the October 3rd Thursday Web Forum. I'm Hillary Morris. I work on user support and communications for the South Atlantic and Southeast Conservation Blueprints. We host this Web Forum every third Thursday of the month, and it's intended to share the latest updates on the blueprint, get input and involvement from folks like you, and share exciting science in the world of landscape conservation in our region. So we're glad you're here. A couple logistics. I will ask that you keep yourself on mute throughout the presentation. I do have the power to mute everybody, but I'd rather not use it so we can interact a little bit more freely in our Q&A. And as a heads up, you probably see that we are recording this web forum just as an option for the one or two people who inevitably wanted to attend but had a conflict. I'll post that recording link on YouTube to the calendar event for this webinar on the South Atlantic LCC website within a day or two of today's talk. So here's our usual agenda. I'll start by introducing our speaker who will present for 30 to 45 minutes or so. We'll have time for Q&A and discussion at the end. I'll wrap up by previewing next month's webinar, and then we'll have some updates from staff. So before I move on to introducing our speakers, did anybody have questions or comments? Let me bring up the chat as well. All right, we'll go ahead and jump in. Today we're going to be hearing from Matt Poti and Arliss Winship with the NOAA National Centers for Coastal and Ocean Science. Matt's going to do the bulk of the talk, and then Arliss will be here for questions as well at the end. So Matt is a spatial ecologist and Arliss is a quantitative marine ecologist, and they have been working on a study to map the predicted distributions of deep sea corals and hardbottom habitats across the U.S. Southeast Atlantic. And just as a note, for those of you following the blueprint, we are hoping to use this data to update the hardbottom and deep sea coral indicator that we introduced to the South Atlantic blueprint this last year in Blueprint 2021. And we intend to expand that indicator across the Atlantic coast for the upcoming 2022 Southeast blueprint. So we're very excited about this data and hope that you all are too. So with that, I will hand things over to you, Matt. You can go ahead and share your screen.
It looks like it doesn't want me to share my video while I share my screen, so I apologize that you can't see my face. It actually disabled the button. But anyway, I'll go ahead and get started. So thank you, Hillary, for the introduction. As Hillary said, I'm going to be talking about work that we're really wrapping up right now that was funded by the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management to provide information about the spatial distributions of deep sea coral and hard-bottom habitats off the southeastern U.S. And this is a multi-year study. It actually began back in 2016 with a very intensive data synthesis compilation of data records to use in the models, and then more recently predictive modeling work with statistical models to predict and map these distributions. The work has been done by our group at NOAA NCOS, the National Centers for Coastal Ocean Science. I'm Matt Poti, as Hillary said, a spatial ecologist in the group. I'm the federal representative of our modeling team, and my colleague Arliss Winship is on the line with us as well. He's the modeling team lead for our contract staff and one of the co-architects of the predictive model framework that we used in this study. We also had contributions from our Deep Coral Ecology Lab. Peter Atnoyer in Charleston leads this team, and also the NOAA Deep Sea Coral Research and Technology Program. Tom Horrigan and Heather Coleman from that program were heavily involved in the development of the study, interpretation of the data, and the model outputs. And So I want to provide background about this study. We need information on deep sea coral and hard-bottom habitat distributions and how we went about filling information back. So, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management is responsible for managing offshore activities such as of oil and gas or mineral resources or renewable energy as well. And these activities can disturb the seafloor, and that might impact sensitive biota like deep sea corals or other things that might live on hard substrate. And so BOEM needs information about where those habitats exist so they can either avoid those habitats, mitigate any impacts to them, provide restoration, whatever the case may be. They need to know where those habitats exist so they can prepare and plan for that in their management of those habitats. I should step back and say that our study area, the Southeast US, as we've defined it. So as I think I was saying, hopefully you heard me mention that our study area is defined by the BOEM planning areas for the Southeast, which includes the Straits of Florida planning area, which wraps around the southern part of Florida. The South Atlantic planning area is really sort of from central Florida up to about the boundary between North and South Carolina, and then a mid-Atlantic planning area, which we included because it encompassed most of the offshore North Carolina area and also some important areas where there are submarine canyons farther north up toward Delaware Bay, Norfolk Canyon and Baltimore Canyon in particular. So deep sea corals are considered by BOEM an important sensitive benthic habitat and also are important for conservation consideration by many other folks because they can form complex three-dimensional structures that provide habitat for a lot of other organisms. Here there's a picture of a few of those. A squat lobster is an example of a crustacean. There's a very tiny little snail right here. Other things that live on them, echinoderms. I think there's an urchin down here. Sponges are often associated with these coral habitats, and really they provide these vibrant, really interesting, although patchy, habitats on the seafloor. Exposed hard substrate itself can also be important for management because it provides attachment for organisms like the corals that I mentioned already, and sponges, other things as well living in those habitats. And there are studies in this region that also indicate that exposed hard substrate may be associated with higher diversity and abundance of large fish as well, particularly on the shelf and the shelf break. So these are important habitats. BOEM needed information about where they're located in the region, and so our intent was to provide that. Just additional background in terms of what we knew already going into the study. The State of Deep Sea Corals report that NOAA publishes every few years indicated that there are 4 major areas of hard-bottom habitats in the region that support deep sea coral communities. These are well-studied known areas, and that includes the Miami and Portales terraces. So the Miami Terrace here offshore of Miami, South Florida. The Portales Terrace is sort of offshore of the mid-Florida Keys. And there are adjacent escarpments dropping off into deeper waters offshore of those that are also known to be home to deep sea coral communities. There's an area off of Florida where there's an extensive series of mounds of the Stony Coral Oculina. This is actually already protected. It's managed by the South Atlantic Fishery Management Council, the Oculina habitat area of particular concern. Along the continental shelf and shelf break, there are a number of taxa of mesophotic and deep sea corals that are found, really stretching all the way from Florida up to the area off Cape Hatteras. And then also on the continental slope, including the wide and until recently not very well explored, and maybe still not very well explored, but getting better in terms of how much it's been explored, the Blake Plateau, which is this broad area here where the slope drops. There's this wide plateau, and then around here at 1,000 meters, it begins to drop again on this escarpment. There's a really neat feature here called the Blake Spur. Just a really interesting area where there's still not a lot of information. Farther north, not mentioned in that chapter of the State of Deep Sea Coral report, but important for our study are these submarine canyons that incise the continental slope, and in some cases the canyons actually incise the shelf as well. And those are places that have been explored over the past decade or so in particular, and they're really interesting areas of steep walls with overhangs and hard nooks and crannies with corals just draped all over them, including farther to the north as well. Those canyons extend all the way north into Canada. So why do we need predictive models then? If people have really explored this area and there's information saying where there are important places with deep sea coral communities, why do we need predictive models? As I think I mentioned already, we've explored, or folks have explored, lots of areas in the region, but there are still many, many areas that haven't been explored. It's vast. Here's just an example. These are the data that went into our models. It's not all of the data in the region, but you can see there are pretty wide areas with very little coverage. The Oceanus Explorer from NOAA has more recently done some dives here in later 2019. They're actually going back out next week to do more dives there. And I have a call with them later this afternoon to talk about using these models to help plan some of those dives. But the point being, there's a lot of unexplored area. Field surveys are very costly. They're logistically challenging. You can go out for weeks at a time and only do a small number of dives because of the challenges of surveying the deep sea with underwater vehicles like ROVs or AUVs or submersibles. So models can provide information that can give comprehensive maps of the predicted distributions of these organisms. And those are useful for things like siting and environmental assessment of offshore activities, such as how BOEM will use the products, as well as for conservation and restoration and management. For example, as I mentioned, the South Atlantic Fishery Management Council is where the models, and likely will use information from the models and their decisions related to the coral amendment that they put in place, the HAPCs, the habitat areas of particular concern, things like that. And this information can support and provide information as well about where people should look next. And I mentioned the Oceanus Explorer will be going out in the next week or so. And we can provide information about places where we predict there's coral habitat where no one has yet looked. Those would be likely good candidates for going and surveying with an ROV. So just a bit about how predictive models work. We take observed occurrence data. This could be presences, it could be the presence and absence from survey information, it could be measures of abundance or density. That information is integrated with environmental variables that describe things like the seafloor and its shape, the oceanographic characteristics, substrate type, it could include geography. Those are related, these functional relationships give an estimate of how the occurrence, whether it be probability of the thing occurring, the abundance of the organism, how that relates to variation in the variable itself. So for example, here you can see that there's a higher probability of occurrence in this example at a particular depth range. And these functional relationships then are used to predict and map the occurrence across the entire study area of interest. That's sort of a general framework for how these models work. Oops. There are some existing models in the Southeast. The earliest, about, I think, 11 or 12 years ago, are some unpublished regional scale models for some structure forming stony corals that Andy Davies created. We also have some almost a decade old regional scale models for a few species and a genus of structure forming stony corals and several other groups of deep sea corals. And then just after that, there were some regional scale models for Lophelia pertusa, an important structure forming stony coral. And more recently, Ryan Gasparo from Eric Cortez's lab at Temple has been doing models at multiple scales for Lophelia pertusa, including some very localized models at an area known as Richardson Hills, where in the last few years, a very large area of Lophelia reefs has been documented in some work that's been done by BOEM, NOAA, USGS as part of a program called Deep Search. So there are existing models. And the question then that would be fair to ask is, why do we need new ones? And really, there are a few key reasons. So the earlier models used environmental predictors that were derived primarily from regional bathymetry. This is data characterizing the depth of the seafloor. And it just didn't provide, that regional bathymetry didn't provide the fine scale information that you can get from multi-beam mapping. And a lot of multi-beam mapping of this region has been done in the past decade. And that has allowed us to see places where there are these mounds of corals, where there are interesting hard bottom features like ledges and ridges that were unknown prior to the mapping. And so we wanted to develop models that were at a scale that would capture that really interesting seafloor variability. The earlier models often were for broader taxonomic groups, combining taxa with different habitat requirements. And there are studies that have shown that models for broader groups are prone to over-predicting habitat when they're combining taxa that have different kinds of habitat requirements, such as maybe different depth ranges where they're existing. The existing models, this is probably the most important reason for new models. The existing models were all presence background models. So they were fit using presence data and randomly selected background locations rather than actual absence data. And more recently, studies have found that those kinds of models, presence background models, when they're assessed through cross-validation, those measures of performance tend to overestimate how well the models are doing. Presence background models sometimes can confound the effort, how the sort of regime of sampling has been done across the study area. They can confound that with the actual occurrence. And so it's ideal to include absence data, or even better in the future, perhaps abundance data, to do a better job of characterizing the actual distributions of the organisms. So here's an example of one of our older models. This is for, I believe, structure forming corals as a collective group. And you'll note that what we have as our sort of measure of the prediction is habitat suitability. This is a relative measure of how suitable the habitat is for corals to exist there. With presence absence models, as we've done in this study, we can actually estimate the absolute, the true probability of occurrence, which is a more useful measure than a relative habitat suitability. So those are some reasons for this particular study, incorporating newer data and using some improved modeling methods that will give us more appropriate and hopefully more manager-friendly measures of occurrence. So our objectives were twofold. I mentioned earlier that our team in Charleston, led by Peter Etnoyer, spent a good deal of time compiling a database of presence-absence records. So some of these are data that are found in the NOAA National Database of Deep Sea Corals that you may have encountered before, led by our Deep Sea Coral Research and Technology Program. So in this case, we wanted measures of absence to go along with the presences that are found in that database, as well as measures of effort, how much area was sampled in a particular survey, and also bottom type. This was what allowed us to update a model of hard bottom habitats. So from that data synthesis, we had a set of records of presence absence with some extra information associated with each record, and we used those in predictive models that related the occurrence of deep sea corals in hard bottom habitats to environmental predictors that captured things like depth and topography of the seafloor, bottom currents and productivity, as well as substrate, so the grain size and sediment characteristics on the seafloor. And that was used then to predict and map potential distributions across the study area for 24 taxa of deep sea corals, and also for hard bottom habitats as its own category. So I won't get into all the nitty-gritty details of the statistical methods, but I want to give an overview of the approach that we used. So the inventory of data that we had available, just so that those of you who maybe are familiar with some of the deep sea survey efforts over the past few decades, you can see which things we included. It really ranged from about 2001 until 2018. That's around the time when our team completed this database, and then we've been working on the model since then. So there are some more recent surveys that have happened in 2019 and 2020. But you can see we also were looking for a balanced distribution across depths and across latitude. So we have records really spanning a wide area, but again, note that there are still some pretty wide areas that haven't been surveyed or that aren't covered by the data in this database. So each database record is assigned a position. So that could be the location of a frame grab from a video or a still image taken from a survey. It could be the midpoint of a survey transect. Those are each given also an estimate of survey area. That's the effort term that I mentioned before, which is really just an estimate of how much seafloor that particular sample is associated with. the list of deep sea corals that were observed in that sample, and then the description of bottom type, which was a categorical description of the primary and secondary substrate type as either hard or soft. So you could have a combination that could be hard, soft, etc. This is a map now just to give you an idea of the amount of samples we had in each of our sites, which is a model grid cell in our case. So there are some areas that are more heavily sampled than others, even among our database records. Some areas may have had just an image or a few small pieces of ROV segment, video segments, whereas other places are more heavily sampled, such as the canyons to the north. So that's an important consideration in the kinds of models that we did. The environmental predictors I mentioned are kind of in a few different categories. So we have here a map of the depth of the seafloor. Another example of a topography variable would be the slope. Typically, we find many of these deep sea corals are in steep areas or places with high relief. So slope can be the slope of the seafloor can be an important predictor of their occurrence. Substrate, this is a map of the median grain size from sediment grab samples. Chris Jenkins from the University of Colorado developed this for us using a 3D interpolation method that he developed. And again, this is trying to get at areas where there might be hard, rocky substrate where corals can attach to, as opposed to sand and mud. In terms of oceanography, this was new for us. We're able to incorporate bottom currents from an ocean circulation model. Here you can see this area of higher currents. This is around the Charleston Bump that you may have heard of before. It was actually new to me 5 years ago when we started the study. This is a place where, as the Gulf Stream is coming up, it gets deflected by the bump, and that accelerates the current speed. And so that does really interesting things for the seafloor and as well for the biota that inhabit it. Our model grid was at 100-meter resolution, and this was kind of a trade-off between the higher resolution multi-beam that we had sometimes at tens of meters resolution and the oceanographic information that was from coarser oceanographic models. The type of model that we use to predict occurrence are occupancy models. These are unique for modeling deep sea biota. And in fact, I don't think we've yet encountered any papers in the literature where these kinds of models have been used for deep sea corals or similar biota. So this was something we wanted to try as a new way to improve on our previous models by estimating both the probability of occurrence, here the occupancy probability, at a given site or grid cell, as well as the probability of detecting an organism. So the detection probability is an aspect of this kind of modeling that's not found in some other kinds of models that folks use for deep sea corals and other similar biota. So I'm gonna just walk through an animation, hopefully this works, demonstrating what we mean by the detection probability. So imagine this is an area of the seafloor in our study area. These boxes represent model grid cells. So we're going to zoom into a couple of grid cells here. So in this hypothetical scenario, we have some corals that occur in these grid cells. So the true occupancy state would be 1 because there are corals there. So if we were to do a survey of these grid cells, imagine this is our little submersible, and it moves along this path where each of these boxes now represents a sample, a replicate sample within the grid cell. So we're looking for corals, In this case, the sub passes over this particular coral, but the view of the coral is obscured by a rock. So we wouldn't actually detect the coral, even though we know that it exists there. Similarly, the path of the survey could just happen to miss corals that are in a bigger grid cell, just due to the nature of the path that the sub takes. And so in both of those cases, even though corals are present, they wouldn't be detected by the survey. And so we would presume that they're absent, the corals are absent in those places, in those samples, even though they're actually present. So these two different aspects of the survey data relate to availability and detection. And in our case, we've collapsed that into one process, an observation process, that we relate to the probability of detection. So apologies for the amount of text here. There are some important assumptions, and I'm going to probably gloss over this, but there are key assumptions to using occupancy analysis. One relates to what I just mentioned with detection. So we're assuming imperfect detection. So the sampled absences, when we call a deep sea coral absent in a sample, it's not treated as a true absence. We recognize that the coral may exist there and it just wasn't detected by a survey. We also assume that there are no false positives. So deep sea corals are only recorded to the taxonomic level that's most appropriate, that the analyst or biologist recording the taxonomic ID is most confident in. We don't want to presume that something is a particular species if it's too hard to determine that from the video. Maybe it needs to be recorded at a genus or family level to be more confident. We assume closure, that is that the sampling time frame is short relative to the dynamics of the system. This is pretty straightforward with corals. They're sessile. They live a long time, so there's not immigration, settlement of new corals in the time span of what we're looking at here. We can consider the system closed. We assume independence of occupancy and detection. And we also assume homogeneity of the detection probability, that it should be consistent across the study area. And in our case, this is unlikely to be met because the survey data we included is quite variable. There are different sources of data, different types of methodologies of their surveys, some using submersibles, some ROVs, some doing systematic transects, some more exploratory. And so we used an effort offset that in part could account for this heterogeneity in detection. We also used taxon and site level effects in the model as well to account for this heterogeneity. The models were done in a Bayesian hierarchical model approach. If you're really interested in the nitty-gritty of that, this text by Carey and Royal is what we followed. Because we used a hierarchical model, we could model multiple taxa at the same time, in our case genera, and this allowed us to not only predict the occurrence of individual taxa, but also to provide an estimate of the richness at each grid cell in our study area. And so that was done for 23 genera of deep sea corals, 6 stony corals, structure-forming stony corals, 5 genera of black corals, 12 genera of Gorgonian corals, and then also separate from that multi-taxon model, we modeled a family, Stylastrids. None of those records were identified to genus or species, so we couldn't include them in the multi-taxon model. And then lastly, we had a separate model where we modeled hardbottom as a taxon to provide a map of likely areas of hardbottom. We assessed the fit of the model using the area under the receiver operating characteristic curve, the AUC. It's commonly used to assess model performance. We also looked at the point biserial correlation coefficient between the predicted occurrence and the true occurrence from our records. And we assessed performance on test data using a form of validation where we split our study area into these spatial blocks and assigned test data and training data to the blocks, trying to have a balance of 70% presence, and a balance of presence absence data where we had 70% in the training data and 30% in the test data for each presence and absence, which was pretty difficult to do given the distribution of our records, but that was our intent as a good rigorous test of whether the models are predicting to areas that are withheld from the model fit. So we fit the models to subsets of the data and then tested their performance on the withheld areas, these blocks that are hash marked here, to see how well the models are doing. So on to the interesting part, how did the models do? So in terms of predictive performance, we're actually quite pleased, given the challenging nature of this test of performance on the validation exercise. There were several genera with correlation coefficients between the predicted and observed occurrence of greater than 0.6, including two important in terms of management, Stony Corals, Lophelia pertusa, and Oculina. Most of the test AUC values were greater than 0.9, which is very good. There were a few genera with lower test AUC values. It tended to be taxa for which we couldn't really get a good balance of test and training data, though. So that we took that with a grain of salt and kind of looked at the models then more in terms of, do the maps make sense? Do the maps of the predicted occurrence match the observation data that went into them? And that's what I want to walk through now for the rest of the presentation. So we have maps from all of these taxa, and these are going to be publicly available as GIS layers as well. And so I'm just going to walk through how you might interpret the maps, how you look at them, and we can look at some key important taxa. So on the left is a map of our actual occurrence data. Black dots represent presences in the presence-absence database that we compiled. The red X's are absences in our database. And for a bit of additional context, these blue dots are other records of presence from the NOAA National Database that weren't included in our models because there wasn't corresponding absence data. On the right is the median occupancy probability from our model predictions, where warmer colors are higher predicted occupancy probability. The gray colors are very low, cooler colors are low. And what we're looking for now is, do they match? Do the areas where we observed these corals correspond to areas with high predicted occupancy probability? Are there other areas that have high predicted occupancy probability that aren't covered in our database, that are unexplored areas, so to speak, that would be interesting places to look at for future exploration, or that might be important to consider for protections if they're not already protected areas? And so here for Oculina, there is a habitat area of particular concern off of Florida that's part of the South Atlantic Fishery Management Council protection areas. And where we see a lot of records of Oculina presence there, we have a corresponding area of high predicted occupancy probability. And so that to us is a good sign. It looks like the model is doing well. And what I'm not showing here as well is a corresponding map of the variability or uncertainty in the model predictions that we can use in addition to the model performance measures to see in terms of sort of spatially, where are the models more stable? Where do they tend to get the same kinds of predictions across the distribution, the posterior distribution of the model predictions, and where is there more variability or uncertainty? Those places might be areas that have less data or even no data, and might be important for identifying as targets for future data collections to fill in those gaps. So I'm going to just walk through some taxa that are interesting. Really, most of them were interesting, so I apologize that there are a lot of maps, but I like maps. Here's another structure-forming stony coral, Madrepora. Its distribution is a bit deeper than Oculina, so we see it here more on the slope, including all this area around Blake Plateau, and that corresponds pretty well to these areas of high predicted occurrence. Lophelia, which is, I think, in the minds of many people, probably the most important or one of the most important deep sea corals in terms of protection. It forms these really cool mounds that are very extensive on the southeast. In other places, it forms more individual colonies, like in the canyons, but these mound features are just really amazing and extensive. They can go on for miles. And so we have records of their occurrence all along the slope. They tend to be found between about 200 and about 700 to 800 meters depth, sometimes a little bit deeper. And our model predictions match pretty well to that and show some other areas that haven't really been explored, at least in terms of what was included in our data, that still nonetheless have high predicted occupancy probability. So that's a good sign too, that matches some more recent observations from the Okeanos Explorer that weren't part of our modeling. But still, there are other places that look like they'd be really interesting for exploration. Selena Smilia is another structure forming stony coral. It's a bit deeper. It's not as common. Here we see a place where perhaps we've got an artifact in one of our environmental predictors. This shape looks just a bit strange, and so we would take that with a grain of salt in thinking about where there's really high occupancy probability. More data should be collected there, including environmental data, really to help refine the predictions in future models. And then lastly, of the stony corals, Enolopsamia, again, it's a bit deeper. We really didn't have a lot of records from some of the data that's been collected on the shallower part of Blake Plateau. And so that shows up here in our models because we don't have high predicted occurrence in that area. So that could be an area where our models are lacking because we didn't have access to that data, and our models really highlight more of the deeper areas here on the escarpment at depths of around 1,000 meters. So there are going to be limitations to the models where we have gaps in the data. With the black corals, we had a few taxa that were a bit more mesophotic found on the shelf. That included Stichopathes, which was observed all along the shelf from Florida up to the Carolinas, and we have this sort of patchy area of high predicted probability of occupancy along that as well. Leopathes is a bit deeper, found on the slope. We see these patches along Blake Plateau where it's predicted to occur at high probability, also down on Miami and Portales terraces. Bathypathes is even deeper still, generally. We're not predicting perhaps as much of it on this northern part of Blake Plateau as I might expect, but we do have areas of high predicted occupancy probability along this escarpment, and even here in this place maybe a bit misleading or a bit strange because of something with an environmental predictor, but this would suggest to me we need more information along the escarpment here where we just don't have records in our survey data. Moving to the Gorgonian corals, again, there are some that are more mesophotic, like Mauricia. It's found along the shelf, as well as Thesia. And then some that are deeper. Caligorgia was a fairly uncommon one, so you'll see that we really have a very patchy map of the predicted occupancy probability. No area is really a very high probability because even where it's found, there are often a lot of absences as well. Then on the other hand, there are some that are really quite commonly found, like Plumerella. I've heard this referred to as a weed, I think, if I'm remembering the right taxon by one of our experts that helped review the models. So it's quite abundant, it's everywhere, and the models predict pretty high probability. Perigorgia, this is one that's interesting because we have these areas where it's observed on Blake Plateau. It's predicted in patches to have high occupancy probability, and then there are other areas with predicted high occupancy probability where we don't have sample data, and those would be good targets for future exploration. Perigorgia, this is one that is really interesting to me. It's actually really beautiful. I should have included a picture. It's a bubblegum coral. They're often bright pink, but also other colors as well. They can form these really big, really bubblegum, vibrant colored and large structured corals. They're found, in my experience going out to sea, I've seen them in canyons. So you can see here that there are observations in those canyons. There are predictions there as well. It's just impossible to see in this map. Yes, just like that, Hillary. And sometimes even larger than that. They're amazing. What's interesting here is we have observation data on the northern part of Blake Plateau, and the models aren't really picking that up. One idea or suggestion as to why that may be is that the genus could be having difficulty because it's incorporating two distinct species that could have a biogeographic breakpoint between them. So that's something for future investigation. And really, models looking at the canyons might do better if it were a model extended to the north with the other canyons in the northeast and mid-Atlantic. Occanella, the bamboo corals, are interesting. They're sometimes a bit deeper, not always on hard substrate. And we've got this kind of neat patchy distribution that matches the data pretty well. Unfortunately, we didn't have access to these records because they happened after our database was completed. A lot of these are from Okeanos Explorer. And so we don't predict that habitat. And that would be something, if folks are using this model, the report will suggest that that information is lacking off of the Florida Keys. And then lastly, we have, this was separate from the multi-genus model, the Stylastrids. They're quite prevalent along the slope here from Florida all the way up to the Blake Plateau, almost up to where Hatteras Canyon is, offshore of Cape Hatteras. And the model really matches that well, a very high predicted occupancy probability, which from what I've been told is pretty realistic. They're quite widespread in a lot of areas. And then hardbottom. This was a bit of a challenge. This model for hardbottom used data that was specifically from deep sea coral surveys, as opposed to surveys that might be looking at substrate in places where there might be less hardbottom. And so you'll see in our data, we have mostly presences of hardbottom, and not surprisingly, very large areas of high predicted occurrence of hardbottom throughout much of the outer shelf and the slope, where the Gulf Stream is really just zooming and displacing sediment that could settle there. And so you've got exposed hard substrate. So the map itself may be a bit less useful than one might hope. Maybe higher resolution models for hardbottom, perhaps focusing on more data than just these deep sea coral surveys, could help improve that. But at the same time, it is probably realistic. There is a lot of hardbottom out there. And one last thing that I want to mention is that because of the hierarchical nature of our model, we could also predict the richness, the number of those 23 genera that would be expected at each grid cell. And so you can see here some areas where we have more than 5 genera likely co-occurring in a given grid cell. And those might be important targets for either protection or future research if they're unexplored areas. And that might be our best sort of a proxy for where there are coral gardens or these abundant, really diverse communities that are important for management. Real quickly, a few conclusions. So as I pointed out throughout the discussion of the methods, we were trying to improve upon our existing models and those others had done by incorporating absence data and sampling effort. Also importantly, these models attempted to distinguish true from false absence through the use of detection probability and the occupancy approach itself. In terms of the underlying data, we incorporated multi-beam bathymetry data and data from ocean current model, ocean circulation models, capturing ocean currents that hadn't been in earlier models. And also we were able to model at the genus level rather than broad taxonomic groups. And the hierarchical model, again, as I mentioned, allowed us to model multiple genera at the same time in a single model, this kind of joint species distribution model. At the same time, there are still limitations. Ideally, for an occupancy analysis, you would want there to be less variability in the number of observations and samples at a given grid cell. But because of the nature of how we had to compile disparate sources of data into one database, that just wasn't possible. But one might prefer for an occupancy analysis to actually design the survey yourself and go and collect the data and then fit the models, as opposed to taking other people's data like we were able to do here, had to do here. There are likely missing environmental variables, certainly related to ocean chemistry. Those are going to become more and more available as biogeochemistry gets incorporated into these ocean circulation models like we use for ocean currents. And then one last thing that's important is that these models are at a regional scale. I would say they're high resolution relative to some of the other models we've done in the past, but there are also finer scale models that have been done in local areas, and those may be more relevant to answering certain management questions or needs because they're going to capture finer scale information about the seafloor. They might be better able to delineate things like those fields of Lophelia or Stony Coral mountains and reefs than regional scale models can do. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. And lastly, just in summary, we have a whole lot of data products that we want to share with folks. This includes a Microsoft Access database with the presence-absence records. We can also serve that as text files for folks that prefer that. And we have lots of maps and GIS data capturing these model predictions. Those are going to be archived at NCEI, the National Centers for Environmental Information, but folks can also reach out to me if they like those. We'll be able to release them hopefully later this fall once BOEM signs off on the project. These data products can be used, as I mentioned, to support environmental risk assessments or impact statements and other things related to BOEM's review of offshore activities that have been proposed, but also hopefully to inform future research and exploration and management of other resources like fisheries. So there are a number of folks to acknowledge. I hope I didn't miss anyone. We had a lot of folks provide data to us and feedback on our model predictions. So many thanks to those folks. And I apologize, I might have gone a bit longer than I meant to, but if we have some time for questions, I'm happy to answer them. And I'll drop the website address in the chat as well for our project website. Once things get linked to NCEI and our report is finalized by BOEM, it will be linked here if you want to look at the final technical report that will come out hopefully soon. We have still the technical editor at BOEM to go through the report, but we're getting pretty close, and I hope that would come out at the latest during the winter. But always feel free to reach out if you have questions or want to know more about the data or want to access the data.
Great. Thank you so much. We do definitely have time for maybe one or two questions before we have to wrap up. So if you have something you'd like to ask Matt or his colleague Arliss, please jump in. Feel free to unmute yourself or use the chat.
Hey Matt, this is Yvonne Allen. I with Fish and Wildlife Service. Great presentation, really enjoyed it. Do you, it seems like the characterization of the sediment is the environmental variable that might be most limiting for your models. Is there some substrate type information that's related to multi-beam that is available instead of just the grab samples, or maybe some integration of the grab samples validated against the multi-beam surface reflectance data?
That's a great question, Yvonne. So the sediment data that we use from grab samples, because of the sparseness, particularly as we get into deeper waters, that can only be interpolated at a 500 meter by 500 meter grid resolution, and our models were at 100 meter grid resolution. So the ability to capture the variability in the seafloor sediment character was pretty good up on the shelf, but really became much poorer as we got onto the deeper slope. Other measures of substrate that could be useful, as you mentioned, I think for multi-beam backscatter, the reflectance from that multi-beam survey could be really useful, but it would be patchy still at this point. Where there's been mapping data, there's not always backscatter that's provided in public archives like the NCEI multi-beam viewer, where we get a lot of our bathymetry data. And then there would also need to be a lot of work done to synthesize that into one backscatter surface, because the different collections by different multi-beam systems would have to be standardized and integrated together. That would be awesome if that could happen, and we would love to use things like that in our models. But at this point, we rarely see those kinds of backscatter syntheses for big areas. We have used and looked at one out in the Hawaiian Islands that was done by the University of Hawaii, but and folks have used backscatter information in more local models. There's a paper in the Gulf of Mexico by Mauricio Silva and Ian McDonald that used multi-beam backscatter to classify a habitat map of the substrate and then use that as predictor information. So that's another way that information could get put into models by creating maybe even as simple as a hard soft map or a hard mixed soft substrate map by incorporating backscatter. And we've done things like that in the West Coast with our partners at the Southwest Fisheries Science Center, but we're often limited by the extent of the mapping data itself too, just like the sediment grab data. But that's a definite gap in our environmental data.
Great. So I'm more familiar with stuff in the Gulf of Mexico. Do you think that the backscatter mapping in the Gulf is? I get the feeling that it's more common than on the Atlantic coast. Is that true or not?
I'm not sure actually. There is also something else in the Gulf though that can give us a bit more information about the seafloor that we don't have in the Atlantic, and that's a map of produced by BOEM itself from their seismic anomaly surveys. So they have a deep water bathymetry grid, and they also have this seismic anomalies data set where they've created like a classified habitat map. Unfortunately, it doesn't quite go over to the West Florida slope, but it covers a lot of the Gulf, and that's been used in models predicting deep sea coral distributions as well. But I think more recent mapping surveys have, I don't want to say done a better job because I don't want to be critical of folks that have collected lots of great data, but I think people have recognized the importance of the backscatter data more and more recently. And so it tends to get archived more. Some of the older mapping collections, it's harder to find the backscatter data, and it may require cleaning up. That just isn't possible if we don't have all the ancillary collection information to do that. Similar to having to grid bathymetry from multi-beam surveys where we just have the raw mapping data and it was never cleaned up and processed with things like tidal corrections.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much.
Definitely, yeah. Hillary made a note in the chat. I should point out that we have an analogous study in the Gulf. It's actually been completed, and there's a report out. You can, on our project page, if you go to the links at the bottom, there's a link to the project page for that study, which also links to the report. But I want to mention that we're in the midst of updating those products already because we learned some lessons from that study that helped us do a better job constraining our predictions in this southeast modeling exercise. And so we've gone back to the data from the Gulf and we're rerunning those models, and we'll have I guess, amended or an updated version of those that we're going to be sharing with folks. And we're also working on a journal publication to get this occupancy modeling approach into the literature as it's used for deep sea corals and other deep sea biota. Because as I mentioned, we haven't come across any other studies that have done that. And we want to get something in the peer review literature showing that it can be done if you have the right kinds of data, and how it's beneficial if you do have that available data.
Thank you so much. I think I've got to cut questions off there just because I want to let everybody know what's on deck for next month's webinar. That will be November 18th, same time, same connection information as today. And Rua Mordecai, who, as y'all probably know, is the coordinator of the South Atlantic and Southeast Conservation Blueprints. He will be presenting on kind of our slate of fall updates to the products of the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy. We're always building toward the CCAS Symposium at the SIAFWA annual meeting and try and update everything in the fall. So we've already released an update to the CCAS goal report, and I can drop that link in the chat, but Rua will be presenting on what's new in the CCAS goal report and what's new with the Southeast Conservation Blueprint. The main update to the Southeast Blueprint this year is just going to be incorporating the latest data from the South Atlantic Blueprint that we just released back in August. So definitely tune in for that. He's also going to recap some take-home messages from the CCAS Symposium that we just had at the SIAFWA annual meeting on Monday, which was a great symposium. And Mallory has a blog about the symposium that will also be going out in the October CCAS newsletter at the end of this week. And then one quick additional update from staff. I wanted to highlight, you may have seen in the South Atlantic newsletter that the user guide has been updated to South Atlantic Blueprint 2021. It's the same general user guide, maps and case studies and suggestions on how to analyze the blueprint data, but it's all been updated to South Atlantic Blueprint 2021. So with that, I will just end on the usual last slide, how to get more involved in the blueprint. If you want a monthly email reminder about this web forum, sign up for the South Atlantic newsletter at southatlanticlcc.org. You can also reach out to your blueprint staff for help or explore the conservation blueprint and let us know how it's working for you. There's a CCAS newsletter as well that you can subscribe to at ccastsoutheast.org. And let's see, 10:59. So if anybody has one last question that they want to squeeze in for Matt or Arliss, feel free. All right, well, I'll let you all go. Thanks again. That was a wonderful presentation, and for bearing with the technical difficulties. Glad we got that straightened out. Everybody have a great rest of your week.